guys, and welcome to my third book review of 2021. Hi guys, and welcome to my third book review of 2021. The third book I read this year is Black Swan Green by David Mitchell. So David Mitchell is a very, very famous writer now. First of all, I would class this as literary fiction rather than popular fiction because it is so much more about how it is written than necessarily the story within it. But we'll go into that in a bit. Let me read you guys the blurb. January 1982. 13-year-old Jason Taylor, covert stammerer and reluctant poet, anticipates a stultifying year in his backwater English village. But he hasn't reckoned with bullies, Cimarron family discord, the Falklands War, a threatened gypsy invasion, and those mysterious entities known as girls. Charting 13 months in the black hole between childhood and adolescence, this is a captivating novel, wry, painful and vibrant with the stuff of life. It has so many good reviews in the back and I would recommend currently. So the book follows a year in the life of Jason Taylor, who is a 13-year-old boy living in Black Swan Green, which is a green with no swans. A bit of an interesting name for a town. And it goes through a lot of issues that 13-year-old boys face, and also issues that people growing up in the 80s would face that aren't necessarily as problematic now. So like my other book reviews, I'm going to start off with spoiler free, and then I will warn you before any spoilers are mentioned when I go into maybe the spoilers of this book. And at the end, I'll give you my rating out of 10 and how likely I would recommend this book. When I first started to read this, obviously I read the blurb, I knew it was from a 13-year-old boy's perspective, and Jason Taylor to me didn't come across as a 13-year-old boy until I spoke to my partner, who obviously was at some point in his life a 13-year-old boy, and I was like, is this really how boys would think? And he was like, yeah, I pretty much nailed it. And I was like, what? Because Jason Taylor analyzes everything around him. And I mean, my partner does say maybe not every 13-year-old boy does that. This is exactly what this Jason Taylor is doing, and maybe what David Mitchell himself was like as a 13-year-old boy. Also struck me as difficult when I first started to read this was every chapter ends with some kind of cliffhanger or some question that needs answered, but he doesn't give you the answer, and then these just pile up and pile up and pile up, and it didn't make sense to me until you look into the structure of this book. So the chapters are the poems that the poet writes. So all you know about are what the poet knows about and what the poet shared with the area, not everything that happens. And if you're going to write a good poem and you want other people to read it, you're not necessarily going to answer all the questions at the end, because then there's no lasting effect. So once I realized that every chapter was a poem, it made so much more sense to me and was so enjoyable to read. I couldn't put it down by the end. I was really, really enjoying it. The book goes into a lot of things in the 80s, divorce, the war, the sexism between men and women. It goes into bullying. Also, this was just after teachers weren't allowed to hit students anymore, so the different types of punishment the teachers were trying out, the mentality towards children and students, and what teachers could necessarily get away with back then. It's all quite shocking and really interesting to read. I would say when I first started, I wasn't necessarily gripped, but as soon as I understood the structure, I couldn't stop reading this book. Spoiler alert, I'm now going to go into spoilers. So if you haven't read this book or you don't want any spoilers from it, skip to this time here, and then you can see what I thought overall and my rating out of 10. If you are interested in the spoilers or you read this book and want to go into more depth, keep watching. Spoiler alert now. Alright, we have to talk about Crommelink. I don't know if that's how you pronounce the name. I know she went into big detail on telling Jason how to pronounce it, but obviously that lesson did not rub off on me. But she is such a cool person. I loved her story and the backstory of her, and my favourite quote by her, "You illiterate monkey of puberty." That is just so good and just so beautiful writing. It reads so well, and I can really picture her. David Mitchell's characterization is just so good in this book. Another quote I really enjoyed from this book is, "A womb is a room made of mothers." Like, it's true. A womb is inside a mother, and I guess to an unborn child, that is their room. And it makes complete sense, and yet you would never think of describing it that way. And this book is full of descriptions and sentences like that, which make complete sense once you read them, but would you ever really think of them? Is questionable. At least I wouldn't, first of all. So that really fascinated me and was really fun to read. In terms of the plot of the book, the overall arching story is that his parents are obviously having a very difficult time, and at the start of the book, Jason answers the phone to strange sounds. Now, as soon as that happens, I guessed that obviously the dad was having an affair. But Jason, as a 13-year-old boy, has absolutely no idea. And the poems don't make sense of being about his parents until Madame Crommelink mentions that he is using the Falklands War as a metaphor for the war between his parents. Now, I couldn't decide which parent was on which side, but it's a really interesting way to look at how a 13-year-old child deals with divorce and a lot of the difficulties that go along with it, especially in the 80s when divorce wasn't necessarily a common thing, and as other students had, people got bullied for it, even though it has nothing whatsoever to do with the child. It's also interesting how the descriptions change with how Jason feels and also as he ages. So the older he gets in the book, or as the year progresses, he gets into more and more detail about what is going on around him and has a much more adult view of things, which is a really good way to show the character arc of Jason himself. It also shows this in Jason's mother, how she goes from a housewife who necessarily doesn't enjoy her life to a woman who has her own job, her own skills, and is very proud of what she does, to the point where she gets the confidence to divorce the man who is obviously cheating on her. Whereas the dad himself, bless him, has a terrible time. He goes from having a good job to losing that, divorces with his wife, and then he moves in with this woman who he has apparently known since school, but now has the difficulty of trying to patch up a relationship between his children, who obviously now are kind of leaning towards the mum's side of this since it was him who cheated. Likewise, his sister goes from being a teenage girl to a woman who is moving out to university. She has a boyfriend who she then dumps and goes out with someone at her university. She's so smart, and I do enjoy the arguments between his sister and his dad. They are so good. Like all of David Mitchell's work, everything seems to link. So the slightest minute detail in this story comes back later on. And as I said before, when I first started to read it, I was disappointed because the chapters don't answer the questions. But then I was so relieved at the end when he does answer them. And the only one I didn't see coming was the grandma living in the woods and her dementia. I honestly thought there was some creepy family in the woods. My bad, he got me on that one. And that is it for my review of David Mitchell. So as I said at the start, I would class this book as literary fiction because the enjoyment for me came from when I realised the structure of the story rather than the overall plot itself, as it's only really describing a year in a normal teenage boy's life, but it does it in such a poetic and beautiful way that I would say this is literary fiction. So I have actually given this 2 different marks out of 10. So if we are classing this book as literary fiction, I've given it a 10 out of 10. It was very interesting, very unique and decorative writing style. If we were going to say it was popular fiction, I gave it an 8 out of 10, only because until you realise that all you're seeing are the poems and you can appreciate the structure style, it's not as enjoyable because he's not answering your questions until the very end of the book. And that's all I've got for you today. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this view of Black Swan Green by David Mitchell. If you like what you see, please subscribe to my channel. If you'd like to see as soon as I upload, click that little bell down below. You can also follow me on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or Tumblr. I post general bookish pictures, as well as my writing tips and unboxings on there. And thanks for watching, guys.